Today, we're plunging into a topic that seems to keep coming back, doesn't it? Financial crises.
It really does. And we're looking at it through the lens of manias, panics, and crashes. You know, the classic by Aliber, Kindleberger, and McCall. This is the latest edition from 2023.
Right, the 8th edition. And this book, it covers a huge sweep of history, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Centuries. Goes way back to things like the Kipper and Whippert site in the 1600s, Tulip Mania, of course.
Everyone knows Tulip Mania.
Exactly. And it brings you right up to, the 2008 Great Recession, touches on crypto, even current stuff like Chinese housing.
So it really hammers home this idea that these crises aren't just like modern flukes. They call them a hardy perennial.
That's the term they use.
Yes.
Suggesting they're deeply rooted, almost expected if you look at the long history.
Maybe not inevitable, but certainly historically common.
Yeah, that recurrence is really one of the book's core messages.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then. Let's try to unpack this. What are these patterns? What's driving them? And importantly, what can this long view teach you about navigating, well, today's world, which always seems prone to this kind of speculative stuff?
Sounds good. The book lays out a pretty clear model, kind of a stylized pattern for how many crises unfold.
Okay. How does it start?
It usually begins with what they call a displacement, some kind of shock, maybe a new invention, a policy change, something that shifts the economic outlook.
Ah, so something changes and suddenly there look like new ways to make profit.
Exactly. New opportunities appear. But here's where the pattern kicks in.
It doesn't just stop at opportunity.
No. The opportunities get seized, but then they're overdone.
Yeah.
Slides from rational opportunity into what they call speculative excess, the mania phase.
Right, the point where enthusiasm sort of boils over. It looks irrational in hindsight. What pushes it over that edge?
A huge factor, maybe the critical one, is credit expansion.
Ah, money, borrowing.
Yeah. Investors, firms, they start borrowing heavily. Credit expands rapidly. People leverage up to buy more of whatever the hot asset is.
So credit is like pouring gasoline on the fire. More borrowing, more buying. Prices shoot up.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But that can't last forever. Eventually, reality bites.
Right.
People start to realize, or maybe just suspect, that the upswing is excessive, unsustainable. That's the distress phase setting in. Confidence starts to wobble.
And that distress, it can snowball quickly.
Oh, yes. Into the panic or the crash, you get this sudden, desperate rush to reverse course. Sell assets, commodities, houses, stocks, whatever it is to get into cash or pay off debt.
And that selling pressure just collapses prices.
Exactly. A sharp, often brutal decline.
That cycle feels, I don't know, almost timeless. Reminds me of those old descriptions like Lord Overstone back in the 19th century. He had those stages. Quiescence, improvement, confidence.
Prosperity, excitement, overtrading.
Convulsion, that was his word. Then pressure, stagnation, back to quiet again.
It's a pattern people have observed for a very long time. And the book really leans on Hyman Minsky's ideas here.
Minsky, right. He argued the financial system isn't stable.
Exactly. He saw it as inherently unstable, prone to crisis because of these credit dynamics. And the book finds his model fits remarkably well for a lot of these events.
Like the Japanese bubble in the late 80s. Real estate, stocks going wild.
Yep, that one. And also the booms leading up to 2008, U.S. housing, UK, Ireland, Spain, Iceland. That pattern of credit-fueled asset price surges fits Minsky's framework.
It really seems to map well.
It does.
Now, there's always this debate about speculation, isn't there? Some economists, like Nurk, said it could push prices way off track, destabilize things.
Right, while others, like Milton Friedman, argued that, well, irrational speculators lose money, so they get weeded out, meaning speculation overall should be stabilizing.
So what does the history in this book suggest? Does destabilizing speculation actually happen?
The book comes down pretty firmly on the side that, yes, destabilizing speculation is a real thing. History is full of examples where it causes massive problems before any weeding out happens. The system doesn't self-correct smoothly.
It happens, and it hurts. Why does it keep happening, this seeming irrationality?
Well, the book offers a few possibilities. Maybe people just have different ideas of rational.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the fallacy of composition. You know, what works for one person selling early is a disaster if everyone tries it.
Right.
Or maybe people are using the wrong models, ignoring risks, or just, getting caught up in the story, ignoring inconvenient facts.
The narrative takes over.
It seems like it can, yeah.
Which brings us back to the fuel credit. Section 2 really digs into how credit isn't just there, it actively drives the mania.
Absolutely. It's not passive. In that boom phase, lenders are actively chasing borrowers. They want market share.
Like banks pushing into new areas or offering new loan types?
Exactly. Cleveland Trust wanting to grow beyond Cleveland, or foreign banks challenging U.S. banks in Latin America back in the day. That competition drives them to lend more, maybe loosen standards a bit.
And this drive leads to innovation, finding new ways to create credit, these substitutes for money.
For sure. The system is always finding ways around limits. Like in the 19th century, sophisticated bills of exchange and trade helped keep commerce flowing without needing as much physical silver, effectively expanding usable credit.
Clever workarounds.
Or think about the Eurodollar market in the 20th century. U.S. bank branches offshore realized they could take dollar deposits and make dollar loans without U.S. rules like interest rate ceilings or reserve requirements.
Regulatory arbitrage, finding the loopholes.
The book calls it a marvelous example of that.
Yeah.
And then in the 70s, money market funds popped up in the U.S., offering deposit-like accounts, paying market rates, again expanding the available pool of funds.
So the supply of credit keeps finding ways to grow, sometimes in ways that aren't immediately obvious.
It can even be kind of disguised. The book mentions things like finance or accommodation bills historically. Basically, IOUs or post-dated checks, sometimes based on fictional deals, just to generate credit and borrow more.
Wow. This whole argument over how much credit is safe, how to control it, it's an old fight.
Oh yeah, centuries old. The currency school wanting strict limits versus the banking school thinking money could grow with business needs. You saw again in the 1890s. Hard money versus the populace. It's a constant tension.
And the book links this credit instability directly to huge events like the Great Depression.
Yes. The argument presented is that the downturn before the '29 crash wasn't just about the money supply itself, but the instability and eventual freezing of credit.
How so?
Well, as the stock market boomed, huge amounts of credit got sucked into speculation, especially call loans. When the market crashed, that credit market seized up completely. Banks stopped lending.
It choked off the real economy.
Exactly. No financial oxygen, as you said, which led to some radical ideas later, like from Henry Simons.
What did he propose?
Things like 100% reserves for banks, limits on other kinds of credit, even pushing for mostly equity finance instead of debt, really trying to engineer stability after that massive instability.
Drastic measures born from drastic times. Okay, so we have the pattern, the credit fuel, then comes the pop. Section 3, distress to crash.
Right, the critical stage. That super fast price growth maybe stalls or just slows down. That's often enough. A pause can trigger caution.
And the smart money heads for the door.
The few savvy or lucky, as the book puts it, start selling. But the core feeling is this loss of confidence. Confidence in prices, in borrowers, in the banks themselves.
And that loss of confidence, how does it become a full-blown panic?
You start seeing specific failures. Like before 2008, you saw a wave of mortgage broker bankruptcies starting way back in late 2006. Not the big banks yet, but a key part of the chain was cracking.
Early warning signs.
Exactly. The book notes there was over a year of this kind of mounting distress before the Lehman collapse really triggered the full-blown panic in September '08.
And Lehman then froze everything.
Pretty much. Crucial markets like commercial paper just seized up. Companies couldn't get short-term funding. And you saw regular people getting nervous, pulling money from money market funds even.
The fear spreads.
It does. And historical examples too, like the Barron crisis in 1890. Distress built around Argentine loans. Warnings went out, but the panic hit when Barron couldn't meet its obligations. It's always that scramble for cash.
Which forces more selling, drives prices down further, confirms the fear.
And down you go.
A vicious cycle.
This whole process feels so human. Which brings us to section 4. The greed, the swindles, the role of trust.
Yeah, these manias and frauds, they're not just numbers on a screen. The source really emphasizes human traits. We trust others, right? And we compare ourselves to others' social comparison.
Keeping up with the Joneses, basically.
Yeah, kind of thing. And the book makes this really interesting point. Maybe stopping these things would require shutting down that trust and comparison, just focusing on pure self-interest. It implies these traits are kind of baked into why these cycles happen.
Wow. Our social nature makes us vulnerable. It seems so. And in those boon times, fraud seems to spike. The book suggests greed grows faster than wealth, the reward for, cutting corners seems high, and the risk of getting caught feels low when everyone's making money.
People blur the truth, as the book says.
Yeah, just to keep up or get ahead. And the examples are classic. Ponzi schemes, obviously. Ponzi himself, right up to Madoff.
Madoff was huge, but his promised returns were actually quite low, weren't they? Made him seem safer.
Exactly. That was part of the illusion. But it's not just individual scammers. The book talks about institutions, too, like BCCI Bank, leveraging networks, making big loans to rulers,
blurring lines,
using influence and connections, or Drexel and Milken with junk bonds in the 80s. They built this amazing money machine, underwriting, selling funds, but a key part was using deposits from savings and loans.
which were government insured.
Right, so taxpayer money was ultimately backstopping this high-risk lending machine. And then you have the big corporate scandals of the late 90s, early 2000s.
Enron, WorldCom.
Tyco execs looting the company, Adelphia's family treating it like a personal bank, Health South faking earnings. It's a depressing list.
Abuse of trust at the highest levels.
And importantly, the book stresses it wasn't just at the top. Think about the liar's loans. In the U.S., housing boom, ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets. That was fraud happening at the retail level on a massive scale.
right down to the application form.
Pervasive. And don't forget, the analysts, the touts, like Henry Blodgett at Merrill Lynch, hyping .com stocks publicly while trashing them in private emails.
He had to leave the business, but kept the money, right?
That's what the book notes. It really highlights how swindling can happen everywhere. Directors fooling stockholders, managers fooling directors, borrowers fooling lenders. It's multi-layered.
And one striking point the authors make is about accountability, how it seems to have changed over time.
Yeah, it's quite stark. They contrast the number of people jailed after crises in the 1920s, or the S&L crisis in the 80s. Milken, Boyweski, Keating, or the corporate scandals of the 90s, Lay, Skilling, Ebers, with how few people faced serious consequences, like jail time, after the massive fraud in the 2003-2008 U.S. housing boom. Despite the scale of it, it's a noticeable difference, they point out.
That comparison really makes you think. So when the crisis hits, what do the authorities do? Section 5 gets into the policy response, the lender of last resort idea.
Yeah, there's always this tension. Do you let it burn? The purgative fires idea, let weak firms fail, let deflation happen, or do you step in?
And the main way to step in is acting as a lender of last resort.
Right. The dernier resort, the last option for getting funds when markets freeze up.
And the classic rule comes from Walter Bagehot, right? Lend freely.
But only to firms that are illiquid, just short on cash, not insolvent, meaning fundamentally bankrupt, and charge a high rate.
Sounds clear enough, but
But the huge problem, as the book points out, is telling the difference in the middle of a panic. When asset prices are collapsing, even a basically sound institution can look insolvent if forced to sell assets immediately. Cash is king, and nobody has enough.
So applying the rule cleanly is almost impossible in real time.
Extremely difficult. So historically, you saw more ad hoc stuff. The Bank of England lending on weird collateral sometimes. The U.S. Treasury stepping in occasionally. New York banks using clearinghouse certificates in 1907, often improvised.
But intervening, even if necessary, creates that other problem, moral hazard.
Huge issue. If everyone knows they'll get bailed out if things go really bad, they might take more risks in the first place. Why worry if the safety net is there?
Especially for the creditors of too-big-to-fail institutions.
Exactly. They feel protected, so they don't monitor risk as closely. It can encourage the very behavior that causes the crises. It's a real dilemma.
A constant balancing act.
And financial innovation plays into this too, like ways wealthy people can spread money across banks to maximize deposit insurance coverage, creating guaranteed liquidity for themselves.
Interesting. Now, these crises often jump borders. So Section 6 looks at the idea of an international lender of last resort.
Right. If crises spread globally, maybe the response needs to be global too. Plus, the historical argument is that downturns without international support, like 1873, 1890, 1931, tended to be longer and deeper.
So who plays that international role, historically?
It often fell, kind of de facto, to the country with the main financial center. London for a long time, then arguably the U.S., the Fed, more recently.
Were there formal efforts?
Well, you had the League of Nations,
Yeah.
the BIS. After World War II, the IMF and World Bank were set up at Bretton Woods. The IMF was meant to help with currency issues, then got into managing developing country debt. But its lending was often seen as slow, conditional.
Not quite the immediate lend freely approach of Bagehot.
Not really, but one key tool developed were central bank swap lines, starting in the 60s. Basically, central banks agreeing to lend currency to each other short term. Initially for exchange rates, but they evolved.
How so?
They became like bridges, quick cash, for a country needing foreign currency while waiting for a slower IMF program.
Okay, then the Asian financial crisis in '97 must have been a huge test.
Massive test. Huge rescue packages. Over $100 billion committed to Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea. The book notes all the factors: capital flowing in, seeking returns, rapid deregulation, crony capitalism issues, weak oversight. A perfect storm.
And those enormous packages, was that like an international beige hot moment?
The book kind of suggests that. The sheer size, the big number approach, felt like trying to overwhelm the panic by lending freely on a global scale, even if the solvency questions were messy.
Fast forward to the 21st century, and the book really positions the U.S. Federal Reserve as the key global dollar lender of last resort.
Very much so. In 2008, and again in the 2020 COVID shock, non-U.S. banks desperately needed U.S. dollars because so much global business runs on dollars. Their usual funding sources dried up.
And the Fed stepped up.
Big time. They massively expanded those swap lines, providing dollars to central banks like the ECB, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of England, who then lent them to their own banks. Crucially, after October 2008, the swaps with key partners had no ex-ante limits.
Unlimited dollars if needed. Wow.
An extraordinary step. The motivation. Probably mixed, the book suggests. Self-interest avoiding a global meltdown helps the U.S., but also acting for the global good to stop a run on the dollar funding system.
And they even bought corporate bonds in 2020?
Yeah, another unprecedented move. Acting as a buyer of last resort for U.S. corporate bonds indirectly helps stabilize global bond markets too, stopping forced selling elsewhere.
So the Fed effectively became the backstop for the entire global dollar system.
In practice, yeah, that's largely what happened during those crises.
This global dimension leads to Section 7, the idea that these aren't just isolated events, but maybe connected waves, contagion.
Right. Is it just coincidence, or are these crises linked? The book traces some potential threads.
Like the growth of Eurodollars in the 70s leading to the Latin American debt crisis in the 80s.
That's one connection explored. Or maybe the slowdown in Japanese money flowing out in the late 80s, impacting things that led to Japan's own bubble. And then Japan's implosion in the early 90s, maybe pushing capital into Southeast Asia and elsewhere, setting up their crises later.
And maybe the Asian crisis in 97 feeding into the US .com boom somehow.
The links aren't always ironclad proof. But the pattern of capital sloshing around the globe and seemingly triggering sequential booms and busts is suggestive. And just generally, crises spread. Stock markets become much more correlated globally during big crashes.
So much for diversification benefits when you need them most.
Exactly. And history shows this contagion clearly. 1860, 1819, crises linked across the Atlantic. 1857 started in the U.S., but went worldwide, the first worldwide crisis.
Even back then, the system was that connected.
Surprisingly so. 1866, linked to European conflict, saw liquidity runs spread across centers. Even currency shifts can transmit problems of rising yen hurting Japanese exporters, or falling commodity prices linked to currency devaluations in the 30s triggering U.S. bank failures.
So global connections, global vulnerabilities, it's not a new story.
Definitely not.
Which brings us right up to date, Section 8, the latest manias discussed in the book Crypto and Chinese Housing.
Yeah, crypto is singled out as a truly novel mania. These digital things on a ledger, not really backed by anything tangible, not anyone's promise to pay.
Then they just exploded.
Went from one Bitcoin to thousands. Huge investor interests, especially among younger people. Market cap hit, what, around $3 trillion at the peak?
And the book draws an interesting distinction between Bitcoin and a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, it argues Bitcoin is kind of unique because there is no there there. It doesn't promise returns like a Ponzi. It's not a liability that has to collapse when new money stops. It just is.
But the things built around crypto can definitely collapse.
Oh, absolutely. The exchanges, the lenders, the centralized platforms where people actually trade and borrow this stuff, those can fail spectacularly, and they have. That's where investors get hurt, lose access to funds.
And the book looks at some specific crypto examples.
Right. Bitcoin itself, described as people openly talking their own books, like a messy pump and dump. They note how much is estimated to be just lost forever due to lost keys. Calls it a zero coupon perpetual, no earnings. Just belief.
Belief someone else will pay more.
Pretty much. The Axie Infinity, the play-to-earn game. The book argues it became less play, more low-wage work for people in developing countries, propped up by unsustainable rewards, essentially marketing money, not real economic value. It ended with a hack, not a run.
And Terra Luna?
Similar story, promising crazy high, unsustainable yields to lure money in, fueled by selling its own coin at inflated prices.
Another unsustainable model.
Different tech, but echoes of old patterns, maybe. Unsustainable promises.
You could certainly draw parallels. And then the book looks at Chinese housing. More traditional, but huge scale. Developers defaulting, construction slowing way down. Official prices might not show the full picture, but there's clear distress.
A massive property bubble hitting problems.
Yeah, their whole model depended on endless growth and migration that slowed down. And now the government, which was trying to cool things, is trying to prop it up, a major challenge.
Two very different recent cases, but fitting into this longer history of booms and busts.
The forms change, but maybe the underlying dynamics have deeper roots. Well, this has been quite the journey through financial history, guided by manias, panics, and crashes. We've seen this cycle repeat from 17th century tulips right up to 21st century crypto.
And we've seen those common elements pop up again and again. The initial shock, the mania phase fueled by easy credit, the crucial role of human psychology, greed, trust, comparison, fraud, then the turn to distress, panic, crash, and finally the policy response, trying to pick up the pieces.
What's really striking is how consistent some of these core dynamics feel, despite all the changes in technology and markets over centuries.
It really gives you a different perspective. Understanding these historical patterns, it provides context, right? Helps you evaluate today's new thing, today's claims of stability, with a bit more maybe skepticism or awareness.
Makes you wonder if these crises are just, I don't know, part of the deal when you have finance and humans involved. Which leads to a final thought the book raises, something for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah, it suggests these manias and Ponzi's persist partly because of basic human stuff, trust, comparing ourselves to others. And the authors even float this provocative idea. Maybe stopping them would mean suppressing those very human traits, focusing only on cold self-interest.
So the deep question this history leaves us with is, if these crises are so tied to human nature, how possible is it to truly prevent them in our society? Can we engineer them away, or are they something we just have to learn to manage?
A complex question, maybe an uncomfortable one.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the long and often turbulent history of manias, panics, and crashes. We hope exploring these patterns gives you some useful perspective.